That's my title, Monasteries in Their Landscapes. Essentially, as many of you already know now, I'm a landscape archaeologist. I tend to see things in the landscape, the material culture in the landscape, with an attempt to create holistic understandings of how the worlds of the past worked. So those lovely pictures, incidentally, are taken from Thomas Merton's book, Silence in Heaven, which is a contemplation by the famous Cistercian scholar of the life of work and prayer within the monastery. The very acute of you will note that the left and right, they're actually Benedictine monks. It's the Cistercians are in the bottom. Now, Roger reminded me that in receiving this invitation, we are within 3 days of the anniversary of the death of Cadwallon ac Madog of Meilienydd, and after 1176 of Elfael. Cadwallon was the founder patron of Abbey Cumhir in 1176. Like Strata Florida, a daughter of Whitland, and Strata Florida founded just a little bit before, a decade before, in 1164. And Strata Florida very quickly came under the patronage of the Lord Rhys, Prince of Deheubarth. Since a concord reached between him and Henry II in 1171 in Newnham, on the edge of the Forest of Dean, Rhys had been justiciar of South Wales under the authority of the English crown, with feudal control over certain Welsh princes, including Cadwallon. Exactly what that control was, we really don't know. But in the summer of 1175, according to the Brita Tywysogion, then the Lord Rhys ap Gruffydd prepared to go to the king's court at Gloucester, and he took along with him by the king's council all the princes of the south who had been in opposition to the king, to wit, Cadwallon ap Madog of Meilienydd, his first cousin, Rhys's cousin, and Einion Clyd of Elfael. And there's a long list of all the people who had fought the Anglo-Normans in one theatre or another over the previous decades. Then in 1179, after appearing in an English royal court, he was murdered on his return to Elfael by supporters of Roger Mortimer of Wigmore on September the 22nd. And the conflict between the Mortimers and the princes of Central Wales is a matter of extensive history and extensive study. But the point I wanted to make in citing the Brita Tywysogion, in the sense that I am asking you to imagine Lord Rhys and Cadwallon riding side by side and discussing and talking about the founding of abbeys, inter alia, of course, as they wended their way down towards Gloucester. And it must have been, I think, a matter of some considerable debate and conversation about the role the Cistercians were to play in the body politic and the polities of Wales. So I, like Roger, want to acknowledge the Abbey Cumhir Community Heritage Project and the work of the Abbey Cumhir Heritage Trust and the work that, in a sense, we are jointly involved in, courtesy of the research program, on the study of the historic landscapes and site of the former Cistercian Abbey. So my title there is Monasteries in Their Landscapes, Archaeological Approaches to Studying the Cistercians in Wales. And this very, very famous illustration of the Cistercians is extremely well known. This is from the Cambridge University library, and it shows the tripartite work, the roles of the Cistercians. On the left, prayer, ora; in the center, labor; and on the right, study and reading, lectio. And these are command and control, the working lives, the daily lives of the Cistercians as they were established from the late 11th century onwards, wishing to become more ascetic than their Benedictine forebears, whom they felt to be a bit sloppy and a bit corrupt. Now, Giraldus Cambrensis, writing in 1184, writing in the same year as the Lord Rhys, went to Llansanfraid cum Teithwr on the west bank of the River Wye, opposite Rhaeadr, with his army, to issue a charter which effectively refounded the Abbey of Strata Florida. And Gerald of Wales says, Strata Florida was in the course of time enriched far more abundantly with oxen, studs of horses, herds of cattle, and flocks of sheep, and the riches they produced than all the houses of the same order throughout Wales. So I'm getting feedback, or somebody's talking? Sorry.
Gail, sorry, David. Gail Peacock. Yeah, she's muted. It's all right.
Okay, thank you. A bit distracting when that happens. Apologies. Okay, Gerald also says, give the Cistercians a wilderness or a forest, and in a few years you will find a dignified abbey in the midst of smiling plenty. And any of you know Gerald, that contained in that, in a sense, are two-edged swords. Two-edged swords, because in a sense he didn't like the Cistercians to some extent, being a Benedictine, and there was a deal of rivalry about them. But in a sense, the message is there, and it's a message you find right across Europe in the 750 odd sites that the Cistercians managed to establish in the High Middle Ages. The picture at the bottom, when he's writing in 1184, he's not referring to the recited abbey that I will now focus on, but in fact this site, or it is presumed to be this site called Hen Van Achlog, the old monastery. It's about 1.5 miles to the southwest of Strata Florida, and it is a curious site. It was reported in detail by Stephen Williams when he was writing his book on his work at Strata Florida and publishing in 1189. And he reports that the farmer of Old Abbey Farm, Hen Van Achlog, his father had picked stones out of that field where you can see Hen Van Achlog marked. However, we have done extensive geophysics in there, and there's nothing there that we can find. So it's all a bit curious, and more work needs to be done. You're going to hear that as a very common theme throughout my talk. Now, it is too easy to suppose that the Cistercians, already by the second half of the 12th century, a huge European corporation, imposed their successful religious and economic business model on the countryside of Wales and its people. I was delighted to be able to listen to Amy Reynolds' talk in your previous talk in this series, and she made clear in July to the Abbey Cumhir Trust that it is now a well-established truism of Cistercian scholarship that while being European, the monks were also very clever in adapting to the local political, social, and cultural mores of the world they came to live, work, and pray amongst. And this is one of my themes today. As Amy also made clear, the politics of Wales in the 12th century were fluid. But what had emerged by the foundation of Cumhir in 1176 and the refoundation of Strata Florida in 1184 was that, for the moment, the polities, the territorial identities of Wales were relatively stable. The Cistercians were playing a significant, if complex, role in the interplay of volatile dynastic ambitions on the one hand, and the potential for a cultural, if not political, cohesion. That map, in a sense, sets up the oppositions that tend to run through popular history. The marcher in the more yellow colors of the south and east, penetrating into the Wales, Marchia Walia, as it was known at the time, and then the pinker colors, mauve colors, are those of the native princes, the Welsh princes, who are protecting Pura Walia. And it is interesting to see that the justiciarship that I mentioned of that Rhys had from Henry II included the northern parts of the South Wales valleys. Now, I hope you can hear me. Just got a label saying I've got to unmute myself. Have you been hearing me? Can someone tell me?
Yes, somebody joined, so it's possible that everybody got muted at that point.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, I hope you're up with me here.
Yeah.
So this, in a sense, the kind of traditional oppositions that are presented in popular Welsh history are actually much more complex than that. The interrelationships, the interactions between east and west, south and north were very, very complicated. And at this moment, in 1184, this is the nature of the political situation. And the Lord Rhys of Deheubarth, the redder colors there in the west, was very much the dominant person, partly because of this accommodation with Henry II. Now, one of the interesting questions in relationship to all of this, one I've been addressing for many years, is the extent to which the Cistercians become engaged in a project, an unspoken, unwritten project of creating a state within Wales, or a number of states within Wales, to be set in opposition to the Anglo-Norman state, the complex, very sophisticated Anglo-Norman state to the east. And that theme might arise. But on this map also, you can see in the green squares, the princes, the Cistercian abbeys that were established through the middle and later years of the 12th century as daughter and granddaughter houses of Whitland down there in the southwest. It was founded by the bishops of St. David. The Lord Rhys took it under his wing as patron, as indeed he did with Strata Florida. And then through the 70s, 80s, into the 90s, and just tipping into the beginning of the 13th century at Vallecrucis, a whole series of abbeys were created, all of them under princes of Pura Walia, under their patronage. Having difficulty moving this on. Right. Now, first, a few things we are working on at Strata Florida in our belief that a multidisciplinary approach will bring its rewards in understanding those two main themes. Our approach is essentially archaeological, exploring the surviving materiality of the past, but our discipline has always been eclectic, using, for example, the methodologies and data of historians of all kinds, as well as environmental scientists and historical geographers. Our core intent is to reconstruct landscapes of the past 4,000 years where we can, and closely examine the social meaning of its constructs by questioning why and how the structures of those reconstructed worlds came to be, and what effect it had on the lives of those who lived there. And our purpose in doing reconstruction of landscapes is to understand the people and the world that they inhabited. In our reconstructions, we are also conscious that the medieval understanding of landscape contained symbolic and allegorical meaning, which often dealt with the human relationship with the divine. Places of encounter and special significance, whether in Christian religious feeling or more ancient cultural experience. Now, sometimes we can come close to this in our work. Strata Florida, many of you will have heard me talk about this. There are clear liminal points in the landscape, threshold points, where people moving through them are making a transition from one state of being, one state of emotion, to the other. And the west door, the very famous west door of Strata Florida, is very much a case in point to me. The door architecturally belongs to the European tradition by and large, but the 15 motifs which are scattered around the outer edges of it as labels, the end of the strap molding features that you can see there, are extremely interesting. They are motifs that are not otherwise repeated within the abbey itself, except perhaps in one location. And these motifs, tetrascale, triscale, vine leaves, inhabited vine leaves, these are all references back, perhaps, to a deeper past, the past that you can see in the illustrated manuscripts, like the Book of St. Tylo. We also are looking very closely, as you know, at this feature in the center of the Abbey Church of Strata Florida, found in the probably somewhere in the late 30s or early 40s, when the site was being cleared by the Ministry of Public Buildings and Works. The irony for me, and some of you will be aware of this, is the person who seems to have discovered it is Rawley Radford, but he made no note of it or didn't remark on its significance at all. Now, this is a feature which we strongly believe is a holy well, and it's directly in line from that extraordinary west front with the high altar of the abbey itself at the east end. To say it's in line, but it's not on the same alignment. It is true east-west, whereas the church itself appears to have been aligned on sunset on St. David's Day in 1184. Geophysics within the abbey itself have produced the shape and outlines of what appear to be an earlier building, because it is on the same alignment as the Holy Well itself. And we are proposing that there is an earlier monastic site with monastic buildings, at the core of which is integrated the Holy Well. And as the Abbey Church of Strata Florida is created and laid out from 1184 onwards, it actually incorporates, as the previous building had, the Holy Well at the center of the offices of the church. It raises all sorts of issues. We now know there's at least one other of these in Brittany, and you can also detect that the shape of the previous building can also be found in some of the walls and layout of the Cistercian Abbey of 1184 and later. It rather looks as though the abbey is designed into a pre-existing landscape, a pre-existing sacred geography, and then it is repeated and picked up within the fabric of the Cistercian church itself, which raises all sorts of complex issues, but I'm not going to go into those now. I'm going to pose a question here. Is that holy well. I picked it out in this plan of the abbey. This is what we think we know of the abbey so far, although there has been more recent work as well. A very large precinct created, inner and outer. The well lies at the heart of the church. The church and the cloisters lie at the heart of the inner precinct, with all sorts of really quite intriguing features, like the great court before the front portal, west portal, a great open space, some of it at least cobbled. We know that from excavations. When you move from the west gate, you see that extraordinary western portal of the church right from the start. But what I want to actually talk about is the water management system here. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the archaeological remains picked out of the water management. The Avon Glasfrud, this river here, which had been canalized and diverted away from its original course here to across the face of what would have been across the face of the Abbey Church, moved in this direction down to the Avon Tavy. And you can see the pools and little reservoirs, connecting leats, header pond here, which takes the water, takes it over a mill here, at least in its later phases, is an iron forge mill. And then we can now track it down through this area here into an aqueduct that we are currently excavating and will be excavating again next year. And this water system has at its head, just here, another holy well. So the water moves from holy well to holy well. And the meaning of water, its purity, its health-giving effects, and so on, I think is very important in considering some of these hidden meanings, some of these more metaphysical meanings of what a site like this might look like. Now, another thing to observe is that this pure water, which is being delivered into the abbey, as well as being diverted around it, is on the south side. Now, the south side of the church is usually taken to be the favored side. It is the sun side, and in the Christian iconography, this has important significance. What we've also noted is that the water, once used within the abbey itself, including in the holy well at the core of the church, then passes through sewers down towards the Avon Tavy, the main river. The Glasfrud is a tributary of it. And we can actually detect a drain exit in the side of the River Tavy. So the River Tavy is the foul water, the north side, which is the side which is least favored. It's the devil's side. Now, in this kind of thinking and construction, we have to be somewhat careful in trying to not over-interpret. But I am, for example, going to talk about Pen Lan. In the east of the abbey is quite a prominent hill. It is part of the abbey holdings. There are extensive earthworks across it, and it is entirely possible to consider this as something of a sacred hill as well. It is in the east end of the church, and mine eyes look up unto the hills, as the psalm writer says. And the notion of there being sacred mountains, holy mountains, is something that's also buried deep in the Christian iconography, the Catholic iconography of landscapes. If you want to ask me about that, we can talk about that later. The meaning of water is kind of doubly underlined in looking at the holy well in the church, the holy well at the head of the water management system. We can also detect that there are at least, taking with those two, 5 holy wells just in this little valley itself. And a very curious site with 5 orthostats marked with crosses in this location in here. And if you compare it with the distribution of holy wells, these green exploding stars, you can see that they are out in the countryside. They're common, but they are much more widely spread. So there's an intense cluster of these holy wells in this location. And for those of you who've heard me talk before, I'm not sure I've got a slide of it. Oh yes, I have. Is at the head of that water. You can see these are the holy wells again in here, that at the head of the Glassfruit Valley, there is a monument, a Bronze Age monument with something like 26 early monuments, some of them kiss burials. And I want to thank Julian Ravest, who's here today, for that vertical shot of one of these kiss burials. But there are also small stone rows and a whole variety of other things. But lacing between the monuments, pathways, little sunken, worn pathways that go down to the spring sites at the head of the Glassfruit. So it is entirely possible that this river, the Avon Glassfruit, it's a tributary of the Tavy, was always regarded in some ways as sacred. And this issue of the adaptability of the Cistercians in moving into a landscape and absorbing and taking on syncretically the previous beliefs and understandings of how the landscape works in a metaphysical way appears to be occurring here. So adapting, and this is a piece of work I've been looking at recently and is quite complex. I'll try and take you through it. The Cistercians in 1184 were given this great block of land that's picked out in that sort of reddy purpley color, splurging in from your direction, from the west, and spilling out across the upper Tavy Valley. This is only part of the estate. The Cistercians were required by their statutes not to take on board the appropriation of churches, which they tended not to do in the early years, although later they did. That is, taking over churches and farming their tithe incomes and revenues. So in laying out the boundaries of the estate, which are carefully picked out in the Charter of Llawtries in 1184, you can actually go around the landscape following it, you can see that they avoid any of these early parochial sites like Blaen Pennal or Llanbadar and Odwyn or Llangunws, Ystrad Meurig on the map here. But as they were putting this footprint across, it would appear that they were actually trampling on the territories, the parochiae, the parishes of early churches, pre-Norman, so-called Celtic church sites, of which these are all examples. And as they did this, there was a negotiation, I think, between the diocesan church somehow, somewhere, and the Llawtries and his officials pulling together the charter, probably in close consultation with the Cistercians themselves. And as they invaded this landscape here, they did not make the diocesan church seems to have made the early sites chapels and made them dependent on parishes which did not lie within the landscapes of the Strata Florida grant. And they created this in 4 instances, 4 detached, not detached portions, 4 townships, in one case detached up here in Llangunws, in order to make sure that diocese had control over the care and cure of the souls of the people in these Cistercian landscapes. But on the other hand, were not directly involved in the administration. It's a very complex thing, but what it shows is that Cistercians, in coming into this landscape, are very, very careful to adapt themselves and what they're doing to a pre-existing world and to other authorities and powers within the complexity of the landscape. I probably haven't explained that very, very well. It's just something I'm still working on, but I hope you get the gist of what I'm saying now. And indeed, what you can do, knowing that, is actually reconstruct the parochial structure before the Anglo-Normans come in, before the diocesan, the reorganized Anglo-Norman diocesan arrangements begin to set up the parishes in the 12th century. One of the really interesting things that emerges from this analysis is that Strata Florida, with its chapel, sat within a much larger parish that I'm just calling Ystrad Flir. Once you take out all these detached portions, Llangunas, for example, had this big area to the north of Strata Florida. And this heightens the understanding, as you'll see in a minute. Oh, it's not a scared landscape, by the way, it's a sacred landscape. You will see in a minute that this is quite an important issue. We can also see that outside of the organization of the church, they're also accommodating the culture of farming that's already there in the landscape. We're very fortunate with our charters to have the naming of key farms and locations within the landscape. And they're the red dots, the pre-existing farms. They're all pre-existing farms with names, as indeed we can probably hypothesize the orange ones as well, for a number of reasons. And these were all what appear to have been pre-existing farms that just went on existing. In other words, they were just left alone. And all the church, in a sense, was interested in, the abbey was interested in, was taking the revenues, duties, and dues that were the renders, which had been previously made the secular lords to the princes of de Hebarth. But, however, they also revolutionized the farming in this area. The black dots are 8 farms who in the 1184 charter appear to have other names, and all those names are changed to show that each of these farms provided one product for the maintenance of the abbey. So there's a horse farm, there's a dairy farm, there's a pig farm, there are grain producing farms, and there's a horse farm, and 6 there is a set of orchards. And these names are locked into the landscape, still there, are an indication that what we have is a domain. Looks more like a Carolingian domain, a mansus, for those who know about these things, which is really interesting in its own right, and appears to be administered from a site in Rhyd Vendigaid, Pont Rhyd Vendigaid as it is today, and then the rest of the farms seem to be administered from Swydd Hynnon in over here, which is another key site. Let's just have a quick look at those. Look at Pont Rhyd Vendigaid. First, you can see the layout of the village. And the things to notice are the fact that it's a nucleated village, seems to be, it was originally on this side of the river. It has a domain mill, this mill in here, an ancient mill, which is documented from the 13th century onwards. And the other thing is that only noticed recently is this place named Tŷ Mawr in here. Now you'll notice that the other center for this estate, at Swydd Hynnon, you have another Tŷ Mawr in here. We know the site is next to a routeway, this one called the Lone Lax, which is an ancient prehistoric routeway, and that is the same road as this, Abbey Road, which passes then on westwards to the abbey itself. Now, there's also a mill. Here's the medieval Cistercian mill in here, with their own very identifiable way of constructing the header tanks and reservoirs in here. And Tŷ Mawr, I am postulating, and from other sites we've looked at around the Upper Teifi Valley, that this in fact originates as Tŷ Mair, which appears to indicate that we've got a Mairdrev. That is something that we know in the laws, which are the administration centers for officials of the princes within the law codes. And we can detect these Mairdrevi within the landscape. So again, the Cistercians are going in, but they're selecting and using and choosing places of significance in an earlier landscape, we believe. So we can actually reconstruct the world that the Cistercians come into. On the left-hand side, you can see the Tŷ Mair, you can see the Mairdrev at Reed Vendigaid. There is also Tir Mair to the south, which appears to be the lands of the Mair himself, the royal official. And the valley that Strata Florida sits in today had its farms, its ancient farms, all of them on there become one way or another domain farms, except for Llys Penarth, which is picked up and enfolded inside of the abbey itself. And this, probably the royal site that's granted to the abbey, becomes the abbey farm. And then Waun Wen, the abbey, the farm named in the charters to the south, seems to have been sacrificed for the creation of Abbey Wood to the south of the abbey precincts. On the right-hand side picture, you can see the footprint of the abbey going in. They create meadow enclosures next to their horse farm of Dolabolion, which is quite interesting. And the Abbey Wood, we're just about to publish the article on that, has the traces and remains of a pre-Cistercian, pre-Norman field system inside of it. If we widen the view, we can see also that there's some intriguing things going on. Again, we're wrestling with this. This is just the beginnings of trying to understand this. There's the footprint, the main core grant of the abbey, 2 bits, a great central Cistercian block spanning the Cambrian mountains and dropping down towards the River Wye, and a coastal grange, a coastal grant, which appears to be given to them, so that Strata Florida has an access to the sea for the exporting of their wool in particular, but also for bringing in and drawing in the famous Dundry stone, the wonderful yellow honey-coloured stone from which the significant parts of the abbey were constructed, brought from Bristol. Now, if we look at that footprint of that and then map it against the to the north in blue, what we know are the lands are associated and attached to Llanbadarn Fawr, the great class church of St Padarn near Aberystwyth. We know its landscapes because these were granted at the beginning of the 12th century to Gloucester itself. And to the south, we have the lands of St David, a bit more nebulous. There's the great manor of Llandewi Brefi, and it's potentially its original class site with the church on it now. And Heather James several years ago pointed out that this association with that class church can be picked out in the vicars who are prebendary vicars, in other words, have stalls in the church itself and have some kind of relationship, canonical relationship with the church itself. Heather was really interested to look at these, which appeared to pick out an ancient routeway across the mountains, vaguely heading from Hainvanu, Old Menevia, Old St David's, across the mountains and into the upper part of the Wye Valley. My point, I think, is that the grant is not a random selection of lands. but it appears to be carefully inserted into a pre-existing landscape of the class church. And you can pick that out also. Llangurig over here, and then St. Harman, which is has a relationship with Abbey Combe here that I will come on to. Now, I want to, having just picked out a few points in our recent work on Strata Florida, there's an awful lot. I could spend hours, as you well know, talking about Strata Florida. I want to turn to Abbey Combe here and just to think a little bit about what it is at Strata Florida and our work there, our methodologies, might reflect on what's going on in other Cistercian abbeys in Wales, and to try and draw a few very initial conclusions at the end. This plan, I've redrawn it, but it is very much based on the work of Julian Ravest and the research group, which has identified much more clearly now what we think might be the footprint of the precinct of the Abbey. Still some questioning, still some thought going on about it. These are never set in tablets of stone. The remarkable church, with its great length, is picked out in that mauve color at the center. And it appears to sit pretty much in the central position within the precinct of the Abbey in here. There are other embankments we don't know about, like this yellow one down in the bottom left-hand corner, and other banks like this, what do you call that, maroon color, up in the top left-hand corner, which may well be to do with the siege of the 17th century. A mill site, which still functions, or still functioned as a mill until very recently, is in the bottom right-hand corner of the Abbey in here. And the water systems being used appear to be the main stream that flows along the valley, but probably managed and diverted in the kinds of ways that we saw at Strata Florida. I want to note also St. Mary's Church in here, which is interesting, because we have in the St. Mary's Church at Strata Florida a chapel which we now firmly believe is a remnant of the pre-existing Celtic monastery at Strata Florida. Is this some kind of indication, this church in here? I'll come back to those questions a little bit later on. Julian has produced, however, some more recent and interesting work. I don't know if Julian's had the chance to present this to the research group yet, or to the on a Zoom. But in a sense, I'm just going to borrow it for the moment. This is based on air photographs taken in the very dry summer of 2018 by Toby Driver of the Royal Commission. And one of the big questions about the church at Abbey Combe here, the monastic complex, is, well, two questions glaring. Was there a cloister built? And was there an east end? Well, Julian and I and others have discussed this at some length, but I think I am prepared to concede that something of a cloister is created here, but it is all really a little odd and needs some explanation. We can see the beginnings of a chapter house, for example, on the where it should be on the east side of the Abbey. But other things in yellow appear to be great spreads of rubble and collapse, apart from this little triangle down in the bottom left-hand corner. And in fact, I think there's another one as well. I'll ask Julian to reflect on this in a minute. Another one in here, just above the chapter house. And I think the thinking at the moment is that these may well be ravelins associated with the defences put around the house in the Civil War battle that took place here. widening out, again, using Julian's work here, not only can you see the vague shape, complex shape of the cloisters to the south, and something of the chapter house, but it's not that structure because it sticks too far out into the claustral complex. Here's that ravelin, and here's the other one, and we're assuming that the 17th century house is over the east end in here. We have not fathomed whether or not the east end had the whole presbytery and cross and transepts and so on. But I widened it out a bit to show you that also Julian has managed to identify another building in here, which appears to be medieval. It's on the same alignment as the Cistercians. What all these mean, I think only time will tell. We need to apply more work to this, and we hope to get some ground penetrating radar done within the period of the research program, the Sacred Landscapes Research program. But the big issue for me, in a sense, is how to insert this into a wider landscape. And here is, in a sense, the beginnings of the kind of mapping that I've been doing at Strata Florida. And I simply will be offering this to the Abbey Combe here research program to see the Abbey sitting in this long, narrow, very extremely narrow valley between some pretty high hills around it, with the drainage flowing out of the west and into the east. Now, you can ask whether there's, in a sense, some sacred configuration in all of this. I think I'm really interested in the way in which the water is managed. There are 4 pools, reservoirs, 2 on this stream, which feeds into the Abbey, and 2 on this stream, which feed into the Abbey. This one almost certainly was being used for the hall site, later hall site here, but I question whether these are as well. Are they more to do with the management in here? Not necessarily saying they're Cistercian, because there is also an ornamental water garden in here belonging to the post-medieval house as well. But this is how you raise the questions in relationship to this. There are sites which the heritage group are looking at, one down here, aerial with good aerial, oh, it's this one down here, sorry, good aerial photography to the west of the Abbey, and recently geophysics over to the east as well. The word of encouragement I would say is I've been working at Strata Florida for 22 years, and I still finding things, new things all the time. But how do you reconstruct all of this, and how do you then, what questions do you ask? You start asking the same questions you've been asking at Strata Florida. I think you potentially come up with some quite interesting answers. Work going on. Julian Lovell and Gemma have been doing some work on the Gollon Grange, and interestingly, the mapping done by David Williams in his famous Atlas of Cistercian Lands, the left-hand picture, is in conflict with the charter of Mortimer around about 1200, and trying to work out where the Grange of Gollon is actually a really complex and interesting matter. There are these dots apparently, but Julian perhaps can talk more about this. These dots are various representations of places that are said to be within Gollon. That is, again, as you widen out into the wider landscapes, intriguing questions begin to emerge. So if you pop Abbey Combe here onto the map I showed you earlier, but a map which takes us more up to around about 1200. By that stage, extra grants have been given to Strata Florida, which eat into the lands of St. Padden. They seem to have stopped pussyfooting around with St. Padden, although they don't appear to penetrate at all into the lands of St. David. One of the interesting things that is done, but we're not clear about the exact date, is that they do break Cistercian rules and acquire Llangiri, number 76, on the top there, which is intriguingly wrapping itself round Llanbadarn. Appears to be the adoption of a class site. Maybe Strata Florida was originally a class site. And if St. Harmon is a class site, you can see how that is not intruded into by Strata Florida, but begins to get eaten into by Abbey Combe here. And the relationship between Abbey Combe here and St. Harmon, I think, is something that the Abbey Combe here research group is really very, very interested in. And when you start to map it on a bigger scale like this, it appears to be part of a more general phenomenon of the later 12th century that bears some scrutiny. I'm going to turn away from Abbey Combe here and just look fleetingly at a few of the other Cistercian abbeys of Pura Walia. Vallecrucis does lie within our research program, largely because its literatures, its production, its poetic production is being looked at by Jenny Day of the Canolfan, working there with Anne Parry Owen, and the site is of considerable interest. We were hoping to do archaeological work there as well. COVID and the owner of the caravan site, a fatal combination, have meant that we can't be working there. But we do have the surviving remains of the abbey. I'm jealous, really, because it's much more than we've got at Strata Florida. And the really insignificant monument of Eliseg's pillar, a pre-conquest monument related to the Princes of Powys. And that's been the subject of a research program by Nancy Edwards and Howard Williams, and really some interesting results have been coming there. If we look at Vallecrucis, one of the striking things that you might be able to detect in the picture, the left-hand picture, which is taken from David Williams's atlas, is that the grants of Vallecrucis, completely unlike the grants given to Strata Florida and indeed to Abbey Combe here, are tiny. They are patchy, spread throughout this landscape in the Dee Valley and up onto the mountains behind. The scholars, historians, have long pointed out that the wealth of Vallecrucis, its incomes, were in fact actually multitudes of appropriated churches, the very things that the Cistercians was not supposed to do. I wanted to just have a very quick look, and this is partly based on Jenny's work as well, at the location of the abbey itself. We can't necessarily pick out the precinct of the abbey, although about 20 years ago some interesting geophysics work was done there, but not totally inclusive. But we are assuming that it's somewhere in this area in here, and it'd be quite telling how the stream bulges out at the east end of the abbey site there. But what I'm quite interested in is how that grange, which you can pick out within the landscape, it appears to be still there, many walls and embankments and so on, and how it is that the church is very carefully kept out of the grange space on this little island here, whereas it would have been very easy to just run the boundary down the stream down to the River Dee. I'm also interested in what appear to be names that resonate with Strata Florida, Maesar Achain. We have a Dollar Achain, which appears to be the oxen breeding farm for the abbey itself, one of the domain farms I pointed out earlier. See how the pillar of Elisik sits somehow in the core of that landscape, and to have the river itself, the Avon Egluise. All of this, I think, suggests that this abbey, like Strata Florida, may be on a much, much earlier site. No material evidence to back that up at all, no clear evidence. But the grant of the abbey is interesting. The grant calls the site Llynagwestill, which some scholars put as Llanagwestill. And there is, right up here, a maes llyn. And in Jenny's work, she pointed out that this area, running around this very prominent hill, right at the center of the Grange, Coed Herddin, that this was once the course of the River Dee in here. And the existence of a lake on which the name is based might be of some considerable interest. I think I've probably identified about 50 years of archaeological work to be done there to test any of those hypotheses. Looking at Camer, one of my favorites. Now, Camer is a relatively small abbey. You can see here, it's just to the east of Barmouth. Again, the Williams atlas picks out a major home grange and another grange a bit further up the valley, most of it mountain. And that is it. That's it for Camer. It is a coherent block. Camer doesn't seem to have any appropriated churches at all to boost its incomes. And again, it just feels very, very different. If you go into the landscape, it is possible to identify, I think, at least the schematic outline of the Abbey precinct. And if any of you know the site, if you drive the road around the site, which runs up this valley here, you're passing a stone wall, which I think actually is a medieval wall. And you get to this point and it turns in, it goes currently to the farm on the site of the abbey, but looks for all the world like a gateway. And just picking it at the abbey here, all of the land between this stream and the river is all floodland. So you can identify where this is. As with the Pillar of Elisig, I'm fascinated by a very, very large mound, which exists just at this end of the precinct. The parish church lies outside, but I'm also intrigued by this meadow here in the farm called Dol a Clochis, the meadow of the bells. And I do wonder whether that's called that because you can hear the bells of the abbey, or does it have some other earlier religious significance? Lots of questions. The green, by the way, is the footprint of the Grange, home Grange. Strata Marcella is a total enigma. I've looked at that landscape around there. I find it almost impossible to pick out exactly where the precinct is, although this early air photograph seems to show a corner of a precinct up in here. Survives as an earthwork by the edge of the River Severn. And again, its granges are somewhat scattered throughout the Eastern Powys landscape. One of the interesting things that's come out of our research is that the place name, Mark, there, appears to be a loan word from the Anglo-Norman march, because we've shown how significantly often these names are associated with borders and boundaries. And that's something I'm going to put in front of place name scholars. And my other site, my last site, is Llantarnam, which appears to be created at the time when the priest is Justicia and has control over this area. The patron is a local lord, lord of Newport at the time. The site is now a care home run by nuns, but it does have a very large barn surviving just to the east of what we presume, the west of what we presume to be the main church, which is hidden amongst that Victorian stuff that you can see in the lower picture there. And I want to say, just to acknowledge, and I put his name there, but a master student of Caerleon, Dave Standing, has done an interesting piece of work on the water systems of the Abbey. And I'm hoping to work later in the year with Dave to see whether we can actually draw the precinct of the Abbey. But in these latter sites I've been showing you, really only the beginnings of thoughts and threads. I shan't ever be able to do that work, but I think to show that all of them are worth the kind of study that we've been doing at Strata Florida. So my final statement. In understanding our Cistercian abbeys in Wales through their landscape, there is still much to do even at Strata Florida, where I've been working for over 20 years now. The potential is enormous, as your great work at Abbey Combe here is demonstrating, and I applaud that. We can see that there was, at least in the early years of these monasteries, some institutional cohesion in the project of making these places both sacred and productive. Cohesion came from the Cistercian order itself and its practice of the rule of St. Benedict through prayer and labor, and arguably from the Welsh princes as well, albeit they sustained the practice of knocking lumps off each other from time to time, although I think wishing and hoping that there was a unified and united Wales. At the local level, however, there is enormous variety in the ways in which each abbey, its monks and administrators, inserted themselves into an already vibrant social and economic way of doing things, ancestral in its roots and transmission, but ready to adapt to change and advances in technology. Even in a quick glance, as I've given you today, we can see the difference across Pura Walia, even as today they are still embedded in our living landscapes. Thank you very much.